everyone, and welcome to today's Life Little Treasures Foundation webinar. Today's topic is what is brain training and will it help my child? We are pleased to welcome our presenter for today, Peter Anderson. This webinar is live and interactive. You are encouraged to participate by posting questions to Peter, which can be typed into the chat box at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. All questions will be answered at the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Cassandra, and good morning, everybody. I'd like to start by congratulating Life Little Treasures Foundation on this webinar series, which I think is a wonderful initiative and one in which my colleagues and I are very happy to assist with. Also need to start by apologising in advance. You may hear some drilling and banging. That's because my building is being renovated, so I can't stop that, unfortunately, but I'm holding the phone, so hopefully the noise that you hear is minimised. But I do apologise if it's annoying for you. It's quite annoying for me. Okay, so I'm going to be talking today about brain training. Let's see if I can get this going. There we are. I'll start by trying to explain to you what brain training is from my perspective. I will talk about CogMed working memory training, which is one brain training program, probably the most commonly used brain training program used here in Australia and overseas. I will provide you with some evidence for CogMed that's been done in the past, but provide you with some more recent data from here in Melbourne from a study which we call Memory Maestros. Then I'll move on to talking about CogMed with preterm children. There's been a few studies reported, mainly from Norway, but we've done a recent study with extremely preterm children, which we call the IMPRINT study, and I'll talk about that study. And then I will talk about where we're going with brain training in the future and some conclusions, and very happy to answer questions at the end. There's already been some people who've posted some questions, and I'll try and address them at the end as well. So what is brain training? Well, brain training is often referred to as cognitive training. People in the field will probably refer to it as cognitive training rather than brain training, but generally speaking, they're the same thing. Brain training is an intervention which is aimed to improve a particular cognitive skill or a combination of cognitive skills. It's based on the premise that specific cognitive skills can be improved, and that seems pretty obvious, I suppose, but previously when a child's come in and we've identified children as having a particular problem in an area, instead of trying to improve that area of difficulty, we've actually provided the family with compensatory strategies to try and work around those issues rather than trying to improve the area of difficulty. So this is a relatively new approach for people working with children. Most interventions, or most brain training interventions, involve repetitive training. This is where the child practices exercises over and over and again. The interventions vary greatly on what they're training, but also the length of the training sessions, the number of training sessions, and the type of training exercises. Now, there are many, many commercial products available. This slide only lists a small number. These products are heavily marketed. They make big claims, which can easily induce families to spend thousands of dollars to do this training, especially when they've got a child that's having some developmental difficulties. However, it's important for you to realise that the vast majority of these products have no evidence or very little evidence, but many of them claim that they are based on scientific evidence. This is probably because what they get around that by saying that their programs are based on research done previously. It should be said that it's probably unlikely that these programs are harmful to children or adults for that matter, but they do cost money, and if they do not work, then they are a waste of the child's and family's valuable time, which could be focused on other interventions. This digital brain health market is now becoming a very big business, and this largely incorporates brain training. By 2020, it's estimated that this market will generate revenue of $6.15 billion, that's US dollars. This is the largest program is probably Lumosity, which some of you will have heard of. Some of you may actually be Lumosity members because there are 70 million members around the world. And so they're obviously making a lot of money from brain training. We're going to be talking about brain training with children, but it's worth knowing that only 20% of people who are brain training are children. Most people who are doing brain training are at the other end of the developmental spectrum, the elderly. So many of the new programs are referred to as adaptive cognitive training. And that's what the type of program I'm going to be focusing on today. These are programs in which the exercises that the child practices are practiced intensely. That is, they practice these exercises every day for quite a long period of time, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. The training commences at the individual's baseline ability level. So what can the child do at that particular time? That's how the complexity of the task is structured. And then the child's performance is continually monitored. And then as the child gets better on the different exercises, the complexity level increases. And so this approach is thought to help keep the child challenged but not frustrated. During training, the child does more than one exercise. They do multiple exercises. And this cross-training is thought to increase the likelihood that they'll see improvements in everyday behaviour, but also that the benefits that are seen will be sustained for an extended period of time, not just for a few weeks. Most cognitive training or brain training programs have rewards built into them to maximise compliance and motivation. And it's developed in an environment which encourages a person to try different things so that they aren't worried about making errors or mistakes. The content is age-appropriate, engaging and fun, and in general, most of these programs are designed in the form of computer games. But today I'm going to focus mainly on CogMed. Now, there are numerous brain training programs available, as I mentioned earlier, and the reason for focusing on CogMed is that it was initially developed for children and has been the subject of considerable research, which I'll show you some of that evidence, and there is evidence to support its use. In contrast, most of the other projects have no or little evidence, as I've already mentioned. This CogMed program, which some of you may have heard of, it's being used heavily in Australia, is designed by Torkel Klimberg at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. It utilises some of the cognitive training principles I've just described to improve working memory. This is a program designed to improve working memory and also probably attention. The training is intensive. Children train for about 40 to 50 minutes per day, 5 days per week for 5 weeks. Training commences at the child's ability level, then the complexity is constantly adapts to the child's increasing performance on those different exercises. It becomes harder as the child gets better on these different exercises. The activities, which were designed some time ago, were designed to be engaging and fun, and I'll show you some of the exercise and you can be the judges to whether they're engaging and fun. But there are a number of reward systems built into it to hopefully keep the child motivated and encourage the child to keep training day in, day out. Training is based on implicit learning rather than explicit learning. What that means is that the child is not taught particular strategies or techniques for doing better on these activities or exercises. The child just has to learn through trial and error which approach works best for them. CogMed started as an experimental intervention for ADHD children. There were some small trials which demonstrated short to moderate term benefits. So the developers formed a company called CogMed Inc. This company then accredited certain people who came to Sweden for training, for accreditation, and then they would then go back to their private clinics and utilise CogMed in their private practices. In June 2010, CogMed was purchased by Pearson's. Pearson's is a large international corporation which sells psychological and educational products. From that point, this product has been marketed very heavily. So how does a child do CogMed? What's the process? Well, the child needs to be referred to a certified CogMed coach. CogMed coaches are people who are certified by CogMed, and they're usually a health or educational professional, often a psychologist, but not always. The first step is to determine whether the child's suitable to do CogMed, and that depends on how you determine suitability varies from person to person. But once that's determined, the family attends a startup session that can be in the coach's clinic, or it could be in the family's home, or it could be done at school. The family or the school, for that matter, could be introduced to training, and then there's a session where the child has a practice session with the different exercises. The coach will then sit down with the family and work out when's the best time to train, when the coach can call them for monitoring calls, how to build in reward structures into training, where the best place to train at the home or in the school environment. And the training aid, which is the parent, the coach goes through their different roles, such as setting up the computer, making sure the child's training, and so forth. And also the coach ensures that the program's working on their device and is syncing with the internet. The coach monitors training. He or she can do that through the training web, which I'll show you some screenshots in a minute. But also the coach calls the family weekly, sometimes more frequently than that, to find out how training's going and problem solve any issues that may have arisen. And then there's a wrap-up meeting to see how the training went, how the child's progressed, and work out what the next steps are for that child. Most people would agree that CogMed should only be administered to people who are suitable for CogMed. The problem is we don't know who's suitable for CogMed and who's not. But generally speaking, you would want to be sure that the child actually has difficulty in working memory, and preferably working memory is one of the child's major areas of concern. Here are the different versions of CogMed. There's a preschool version, a school-age version, and an adult version. Most of the first version was the school-age version. This is the version which most of the research has been done with, and that's the version I'll be focusing on today. This is the home page. This is what it looks like. This is RoboCop. Here are the different activities that the child plays. There's 12 activities, and the child plays 8 activities each day. This is one activity called asteroids. During this exercise, moving asteroids will light up in succession. The user then needs to remember the order in which the asteroids light up, and when the program says go, the user needs to click on the asteroids in the order that they light up. Here's another exercise called Data Room, where some of the lamps in a 3D room will light up. The user needs to remember the order and then click on the lamps in the order that they light up. This exercise is called rotating disk data link, where lamps will light up in succession again. The child needs to remember the order in which they came on, but before the user gives an answer, the entire panel will turn 90 degrees. And when the program says go, the user needs to click on the lamps in the order in which they came on, but remembering that the panel has turned 90 degrees. And this is probably the hardest exercise. It's called rotating dots. The user will see some lamps rotating. The lamps will light up in a certain order, but the lamps will be moving, so the user needs to keep track of their position. And the user needs to click on the lamps in the same order, even though they are now in new positions. I think this is the last one I'm going to show you. It's called input module. A sequence of digits will be read aloud to the child. The child needs to listen carefully and try to remember the order in which they are read. When the program says go, the child clicks on the numbered buttons in the reverse order, not in the same order, but in the reverse order. So for example, if the numbers read aloud to the child were 5, 2, and 6, the user will need to click on 6, 2, then 5. And at the end of the training session, the children get to play robo racing game, which is considered a reward. And they get to race against other robots against the time, and they collect stars on their way through. So this is one of the reward systems built into the program. So as a CogMed coach, you can keep an eye on how the child's progressing. This is what you see when you go into the training web. You can see which activities the child has played during the course of the day. So I mentioned before that the child plays 8 activities or 8 exercises each day. And for each exercise, there's 15 items or 15 trials. And here's their performance on each one of those. The green bars represent those trials which the child got right. The red ones represent the trials which they got wrong. And you can get more information. Again, this is giving you more information about each exercise and how well they did, but also the time in which they started training, when they had gaps between training. So you can get really detailed information about how training is occurring in the home environment. One of the big issues in the field of brain training or cognitive training is how to assess whether brain training is working. What we can easily see is performance gains on those exercises that they're training on every day. But this is an expected result, and for most of us, that would not be sufficient to suggest that brain training is working. If the brain training is training working memory, then one way to assess whether it's working is to see whether the child's working memory is improving. And we can do that by testing their working memory before training and after training on tests which they are not doing during their brain training program. That's one way to assess whether brain training is working, and you would hope that if you were training working memory that you would see improvement in working memory. But with children, most families who are considering brain training for their child, they're not doing it to improve their child's working memory. They're doing it to try and improve their child's performance at school or their behaviour at school or in other settings. So really, we would hope that brain training has a wider influence than just improving working memory, and that we actually see improvements in everyday activities such as better reading or maths or improved behaviour. And this is what most people would be hoping to get from after successfully completing brain training programs such as CogMed. Another factor is what level of evidence is needed to support brain training programs such as CogMed. I've already mentioned that I would argue that we need to see benefits in everyday life, real life benefits to the child and to the family. But what size of benefit would be relevant to you? That may differ from person to person. In fact, I know it differs from person to person. So that's why it's very difficult to argue whether a program has the level of evidence needed, because from person to person we differ in our views about this. Also, the duration of effect. These programs often do show effects that we can measure immediately after training, and sometimes 3 to 6 months after training. But if you were to spend $2,000 on a program, which CogMed costs somewhere around that amount of money, and you invest 5 weeks of your life and your child's life to doing programs like CogMed, you would probably want the benefit to last longer than a few months. You would probably want it to last years or be ongoing. These are things that we need to look at, and for some people, the duration of effect, what they expect, differs greatly. And then there's the cost effectiveness. These programs are expensive, but also we need to consider the time of the family and the child. If they weren't doing CogMed, they could be doing something else which may possibly be effective in helping the child with their areas of concern. Now, with CogMed, there's been plenty of studies. This is a relatively old slide now, but you can see the large number of published articles in the scientific literature which have been published using CogMed or refer to CogMed. So there is evidence on CogMed. But I'm sorry this hasn't projected very well, but I'll try and explain it to you. This is a flow chart of the first randomized controlled trial using CogMed. It was done by Torkel Klimberg, who was the developer of CogMed. This was before CogMed became a commercial product. It was done with children with ADHD. They were 9 to 10 years of age. He recruited 53 children who were tested before training. Half of them received CogMed training. Half of them received what they called placebo training. And the children who received placebo training also had to sit in front of the computer and play the same games, but the games were set to a very easy level. And it stayed at that easy level with the thought that this was not challenging their working memory. So half the children got the placebo program, half of them received CogMed. These are the results of 2 working memory tasks. One's called span board, one's called digit span. T1 represents a baseline assessment. So this was when children were assessed before training. T2 is when children were tested immediately after training, and T3 was when they were tested 3 months after training. And on both span board and digit span, you can see that the open circles represent the placebo group and the triangles represent the CogMed group. You can see they're performing equivalently before training, but after training and 3 months after training, the children who received CogMed were performing significantly better than the children who received the placebo program. Then they administered other tests which did not look at working memory. This Droop test looks at impulse control. In this case, it's a time task, so the faster you are, the better the performance. And the Ravens test is a test of non-verbal reasoning ability. So the hope here was that by improving working memory, they would see improvements in other cognitive domains as well. Again, at the baseline assessment before training, the 2 groups were performing equivalently, But after training and 3 months later, the CogMed group was outperforming the children who received the placebo program. So this was the first trial published, and it clearly shows that CogMed has benefits to working memory, but also other areas of cognitive functioning, and that got people interested in CogMed and brain training of working memory. One of the next studies that was published was from the UK, and this was not a randomized control trial, but they went to a school and they got 22 children who they assessed to have low working memory, 22 children. They went to another school, got another 20 children who had low working memory. The first group of children got CogMed, and the second group of children got a placebo program like I described in the last study. The children who received the placebo program showed some improvement over time, a little bit of improvement, but this is the improvement of the children who received CogMed. You can see that they, and these are different types of working memory measures, and you can see that they improved dramatically on these different measures of working memory. And this was immediately after training. They also assessed these children 6 months later, and you can see the gains that the children who received CogMed remained substantial. Again, suggesting that CogMed enhances working memory, and the benefits that it has on working memory persists for at least 6 months. So this is also very positive findings. I indicated earlier that there's been a lot of research looking at CogMed and whether it works. And so how do we try and put all that research together to work out whether CogMed works? And let's start by wondering whether CogMed improves working memory immediately after training. Well, the way scientists do this, or researchers do this, is by pooling the results of all the different studies, and this is called a meta-analysis. This is a table looking at all the studies that these researchers found which they thought were eligible, which assessed verbal working memory and visual spatial working memory immediately after training. They found 4 and 8 studies, and they found this effect. Now, I won't explain to you what this means, but this is a very large effect, and based on this result, it is clear that CogMed does result in benefits in working memory immediately after training. What about reasoning ability? Well, when we do a meta-analysis, we generally get what we call a forest plot. This is a forest plot here. These are the different studies that have administered CogMed to different clinical populations, and this is the effect, this is the group difference between the children who received CogMed for the different studies versus those children who received something else or nothing. If the black square in the error bar is to the left of 0, this is 0 here, that means that the placebo group has outperformed the CogMed group. If it's to the right of 0, that means that the CogMed group is outperforming the placebo group or the comparison group. This black diamond down the bottom here is the pooled result of all these eligible studies that have looked at reasoning ability following CogMed training. The problem is that this diamond crosses over 0, which means that CogMed does not improve reasoning ability based on this study. So no, CogMed does not appear to improve reasoning ability in children after training. What about impulse control? Well, here's another forest plot. Here are the studies. Here are the differences between the children who received CogMed versus the children who did not receive CogMed. Here's the pooled result, this diamond here. It is to the right of 0, but does cross over 0, but does look promising. So it's unlikely, but maybe CogMed is having a small impact on impulse control in these studies when we pull the results of all these studies. What about behaviour? Is another meta-analysis looking at everyday attention as reported by parents. Here are the different studies. Is the difference between the CogMed group and the comparison group for the different studies. They're to the left of 0, which means that after training, the parents are reporting less inattention, better attention. If it was to the right, it would be saying that there was an increase in inattention or poorer attention. And here's the pooled result. You can see the diamond is clearly to the left of 0, indicating that it looks likely that CogMed is resulting in improvements in everyday attention as reported by parents. Now this is immediately after training. What about after a delay? There are fewer studies that have looked at this, but here are the studies. Again, here are the differences between the CogMed group and the comparison group. They're primarily to the left of 0, the diamonds to the left of 0. So it looks likely that even after a delay, the parents are reporting that their children are reporting less inattention or better attention 3 to 6 months after CogMed training. So putting all that together, what we can, when we're looking at the research into CogMed, there have been some things that we need to take into account. Most of the studies have involved small samples. In fact, some of them are very, very small studies. The studies have had limited long-term follow-up. Some don't follow the children up at all. Some follow them up at 3 months and some up to 6 months, but very few, if any, have followed children up beyond 6 months. And the studies have used a range of different clinical and non-clinical groups with CogMed. So maybe some clinical groups react better, respond better to CogMed than others. What it looks likely is that CogMed results in improvements in working memory immediately and shortly after training's finished. And it looks also likely that the parents are reporting better attention in the children. What we don't know is whether any benefits, such as working memory and better attention, is sustained for long periods of time. And this is unknown because there have been no studies that have looked beyond 12 months. So we did a study called Memory Maestros, in which we wanted to see whether CogMed could have a sustained impact on literacy and numeracy as well as working memory in children with low working memory. Hopefully you can read these numbers. We approached the families of 2,700 children. Families of nearly 1,800 children consented to participate. We screened using working memory measures 1,700 of those children, and then we selected the children who were performing poorest on those working memory measures, and we picked out 452 of these children. Those 452 children were randomly assigned to receive CogMed, this group here, or receive nothing. This was all done at school. All this testing was done at school, and the CogMed training was done at school as well. Of those 226 children who had CogMed at school, 206 of those children completed training, and then there was a 6-month, 12-month, and 24-month follow-up. This is the results of the 6-month follow-up, looking at working memory. These are 4 different working memory tests. This is the average on these 4 tests for the children who received CogMed, the intervention, and here the average of the children on these 4 tests who received nothing. They're the comparison group. They just stayed in class when the other children were taken out of class to do CogMed. Higher scores represent better performance. And you can see that the 2 groups are performing very, very similarly on these different measures, although the children who received CogMed are outperforming the children who did not on this dot matrix test and on this backward digit recall test. So on at least 2 of the 4 tests of working memory, children who were administered CogMed outperformed children who did not receive CogMed. 12 at the 12-month follow-up, we saw similar results. Again, here are the 4 working memory measures, the average on these 4 measures for the children who received CogMed, and here's the average for the children who were in the control group and did not receive CogMed. And now, at 12 months, there was only one measure in which the children who received CogMed were outperforming the controlled children, and that was on the dot matrix test. At 24 months, there was no difference. So by 24 months, any benefit in working memory that we saw early at 6 and 12-month follow-up had disappeared. But you may recall that what we were particularly interested in this study was academics. So how did the groups differ in terms of academics? Here are 4 tests looking at different elements of academics: word reading, sentence comprehension, spelling, and maths. Again, this is the average on these 4 tests for the children who completed CogMed training. Here are the averages for the children who did not receive CogMed in the control group on these 4 measures. And this time you can actually see that the scores, which reflect, the higher the score reflects better performance, but the control group are actually scoring slightly higher than the children who received CogMed. So there seems to be no evidence in this large study that CogMed is actually improving academics. In fact, the children who did not receive CogMed are actually scoring higher. What about at 2 years or at the 24-month follow-up? Excuse me. Here are 3 tests: word reading, spelling, and maths. Here are the average for the children who received CogMed, the average for the children who did not, and you can see that the scores are higher for the children who did not receive CogMed, and this actually reached significance for maths. So this was quite disappointing. But we concluded by saying that in our group of children with low working memory, CogMed benefited children in some working memory measures up to 12 months, but there was no benefit at 24 months. By 24 months, this had diminished. We saw no benefits in academic achievement at 12 or 24 months. What about CogMed in very preterm children? Well, why would we expect CogMed to work with very preterm children? Well, attention and working memory have been argued to be core deficits for preterm children. So if we can improve attention and working memory in very preterm children, maybe we can improve other elements of their functioning as well, such as their academic functioning and behaviour. That's the premise behind doing CogMed with preterm children. The first study, and there's been 3 studies. The first study, which used CogMed, looked at children who were born extremely low birth weight and children who were born full term. These were adolescents, 14 to 16 years of age. It was not a randomised controlled trial. They put 16 children through CogMed who were extremely low birth weight and 18 term-born controls. These are different measures of working memory. This is their average score of the children who were extremely low birth weight before training. Oops, sorry. This is the average score after training, and this is their average scores 6 months after training. And what you'll see is that the scores are going up, which is a good thing because the higher the score, the better the performance. So immediately after training, you can see that the scores are higher than they were at before training. And that's for the extremely low birth weight group, but also for the control group. The scores after training are higher than before training. You can also see that 6 months after training, the scores remain higher than they were before training. So this suggests that CogMed had a short-term impact or benefit on working memory for both extremely low birth weight children and also children who were born full term. Now these gains that we see in this particular study could simply reflect maturation, development. But this group of researchers also tested a group of children before training, the training period, who did not receive CogMed. These were term-born controls, and you can see on these three measures of working memory that their performance remained pretty flat. They didn't show improvement that we see in the children who received CogMed. So this green line represents the children who were born full term who received CogMed, and the blue line represents the children who were born extremely low birth weight who received CogMed, and you can see that they showed marked improvement over time as a result of cognitive training, in contrast to the children who didn't receive training, who showed very little improvement over time on these different measures. We've also, this group in Norway also looked at preschoolers, very low birth weight preschoolers at 5 to 6 years of age, and there were 20 children who they tested before training and after training. These are again different measures of working memory, and what they found was that on 2 of the 5 measures there was a significant improvement after training when compared with before training. They also looked at a range of other outcomes such as attention and language, and the children also improved dramatically after training. So this also was positive news. This black line represents the 20 children who received CogMed, and you can see that immediately after training, this is before training, this is after training, that the children showed a dramatic increase in performance on these 4 measures of memory immediately after training, but that 6 months after training, these benefits persisted. This is in contrast to the children here in the grey line that are controls who did not receive CogMed, and you can see that they're well behind the very low birth weight preschoolers who received CogMed. This is all pointing in the direction that CogMed may be a very useful tool for very preterm children. However, both of these studies were small studies, and they weren't randomized trials. And they didn't follow children up for a long period of time, and they didn't really look at what we consider the main outcome, which is academics. So now I'm going to briefly talk to you about our study, which we call Imprint, where we looked at CogMed in extremely preterm 7-year-olds. Children were randomized to receive CogMed or the placebo program. The placebo program, again, was a program where the children sat in front of the computer and played the same games, but the difficulty level was set at a very easy level so that it didn't challenge working memory. The primary outcome for our trial was academic functioning at 24 months. We were hoping to see improvements in reading, spelling, and math 24 months after training. This was a double-blinded placebo-controlled trial, which basically means that the families are unaware of whether they're receiving CogMed or the placebo, and also the people who are testing the children are unaware of whether the child is receiving CogMed or a placebo program. And we saw children born extremely preterm who were born in Victoria in 2005. So we contacted the families of 172 children. We were able to recruit 91 of those children. Half of them received placebo training, half of them received CogMed training, and then we followed them up 2 weeks after, 1 year after, and 2 years after. And I'm just going to speak to you today about the initial results because that's where we're at the moment. This graph is a summary of our results immediately after training. If this red dot and the error bar is above 0, that means that the children who received CogMed improved significantly more than the children who received the placebo program. If this red dot in the error bar is below 0, that means that the placebo group gained more than the control group over time. Let's start by looking at these measures of attention. These three measures are looking at attention, and you can see that the error bars cross over 0. So it's saying to us that over time, immediately after training, there is no difference between the children who receive CogMed to the children who receive placebo. These are working memory measures. So how did they go on working memory? Again, you can see no difference between the children who receive CogMed to the children who receive placebo immediately after training on these different working memory measures. So that was very disappointing, and in contrast to the earlier research findings that I've just reported. Now that was comparing the children who receive CogMed to the children who receive a placebo program, but it doesn't tell us whether their scores actually increased. So here we are looking at the difference between their scores before training and after training. If we look first at the measures which are looking at attention, we can see that neither the CogMed or the placebo group showed much improvement in their attention following training. But if we look at the working memory measures, we can see that both groups actually showed improvement over time. After training, they were performing better than they were before training. So had we not included a control group or a placebo group, it would actually look like the CogMed group had actually improved, which they had. But in our study, we saw similar amounts of improvement in the children who received the placebo program. We were expecting that the children who received the placebo program to struggle with motivation and compliance because we expected the program to be too easy for them. And we expected greater compliance and motivation in the children who received CogMed. But that's not what we found at all. In fact, we found better compliance in the children who were randomised to the placebo program to those children who received CogMed. And we put this down to that we think that CogMed was too difficult for many of these families, not just in terms of the difficulty level for children, but also difficulty for families. So we found no differences between CogMed and the placebo groups post-training in working memory or attention. We saw slight improvements in working memories, but this was observed in both the children who received CogMed and the children who received the placebo program. We now need to work out which children benefit from the program, and we now have students looking at that. Compliance was not great. This program is difficult. It takes a lot of time. It's very demanding. Trying to find 40 to 15 minutes in the evening or before school is very difficult for families, and it is a program which families really need to think about whether they've got the time and motivation to do, because otherwise trying to do the program is really burdensome. So going forward, we need to work out who is most likely to benefit from cognitive training or brain training programs like CogMed. I suggest we need to make sure that the child's cognitive profile is examined and make sure that the children actually do have significant problems with working memory and attention, and that these are their primary areas of concern. If they're not their primary areas of concern, then they probably should be doing another program. We may find that the benefits are greater in different clinical populations, such as children with ADHD, learning disability, and mild cognitive impairment, but we really need to look at that in more detail. We need to look at whether we can improve the training, whether the length of training needs to be adapted. At the moment, CogMed is 20 sessions, but maybe fewer sessions is just as beneficial, or maybe we need more sessions. At the moment, the intensity, the length of training per day is 40 to 50 minutes. Maybe we get the same effect if we train for 10 to 15 minutes. We need to look at that. Research hasn't looked at that yet. Currently, they're trying to train 5 days a week, but maybe we don't need to train 5 days a week. Maybe training 2 or 3 days a week for longer has the same effect. And we need to look at the way we structure and administer the training exercises. People are now administering CogMed in conjunction with other things. CogMed could be done prior to other interventions, at the same time as other interventions, after other interventions. What type of things can we do? Looking at maths, literacy, impulse control, strategy-based learning and anxiety. All these things are being done in conjunction with CogMed at the moment. Now, children very rarely just have problems with one area, such as working memory. They often come in with problems in a range of different domains. So going forward, I think we really need to have programs which target different cognitive domains so we can tailor programs for different children depending upon their different areas of concern. And we know that the benefits of cognitive training, such as CogMed, diminish with time. So maybe booster sessions, these are sessions which occur after training, may help. But when do we do when do we do the booster sessions? How frequent should they be? How long should they go for, etc.? We don't know the answers to any of these questions. But what we know is CogMed is a popular intervention, as are other brain training programs. It's heavily marketed. With CogMed, we tend to see immediate gains in working memory, but these initial benefits tend to weaken with time, although we didn't see immediate gains in children born preterm, although other studies have. Gains in real-life outcomes, such as academics, behaviour, are unlikely, particularly in academics. And what we've found is that brain training is not suitable for children with severe impairments, but more suited to children who have mild to moderate impairments. What we don't know which individuals benefit most from training. We don't know whether if we modify the training schedule will make training more effective. We could change the duration, the intensity, the frequency. We can see whether providing some strategy-based teaching will help their training outcomes. And we know that many of these activities are now outdated and definitely need updating. And whether integrating brain training with other interventions such as anxiety training will make it more effective. So to conclude, cognitive training may help to enhance core deficits in very preterm children, but the research evidence with CogMed is mixed. In our study, we found both CogMed and the placebo programs resulted in improved performance in working memory. The more research with CogMed is needed. We need to find out which families are suited to CogMed, which children will benefit, whether the benefits persist long term, and does improved working memory from programs like CogMed translate into better academic functioning and behaviour. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. I was sent some questions. One question was, have any studies been done with brain training, any studies been done on brain training used in conjunction with dietary supplements such as omega-3? If so, how do the results differ from studies done with brain training without the use of supplements? That's an excellent question. There are a lot of studies being done now looking at nutrition in children with neurodevelopmental difficulties, including omega-3 or long-chain fatty acids. I'm not aware of studies with CogMed that have been done in conjunction with any nutritional intervention, but it would be something worth exploring. In terms of other brain training programs, again, I'm not familiar. I haven't seen any studies that have tried to link these two, but that's definitely something that's worth investigating going forward, because with children with developmental difficulties, it's unlikely that one intervention is going to be the silver bullet. It's probably going to be a combination of factors. One person was interested in brain training for children with ADHD. Well, that's another good question. Clearly, ADHD has been the focus of a lot of research in this area. It tends to show good benefits in terms of improving working memory and attention. But again, as I've shown, the effects tend to diminish with time and does not tend to show improvements in academic functioning. Now, that's what the pooled results from the meta-analysis suggest. So it's definitely an area which a lot of people have done research in, including people with CogMed, and it shows short-term benefits, but whether those short-term benefits persist and whether they result in real-life, everyday benefits in things such as academics is questionable. Another really good question is, what is the optimal age range for CogMed to address attention issues? I don't know the answer to that question. We have done our studies at the age of 7. We did that because the children were in their second formal year of schooling, and generally speaking, and were really starting to expand in their numeracy and literacy, and we thought that would be a fantastic time to do a working memory training as they were really expanding their skills in these academic areas. However, some could also argue that actually doing it as early as possible would be more beneficial, and I think that's a strong argument as well. So maybe even doing it at 4, 5, 6, 7 years of age would be the optimal time to do cognitive training. But there is no evidence I'm aware of to suggest that one age range is better than another as yet. So that's the end of the questions that I've received, but I'm happy in the last few minutes to answer any final questions. No, I don't see any other questions. So Cassandra, maybe we finish the webinar there.